Continue now to honor the legacy of San Francisco Giants legend Willie Mays. He died yesterday at the age of 93. And joining us now to talk about the life and legacy of Willie Mays is Sean Flesher. He's an assistant professor of marketing and communication with San Jose State. Sean, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So when you hear that Willie Mays has passed away, what do you think his legacy is?
Well, I think he has a larger-than-life legacy. He was your favorite baseball player's favorite player. The great Frank Robinson even mentioned that you can't exaggerate how great Willie Mays was, but he also played so many different roles in the life that he had. He's a veteran. He was, many may not realize that during the Korean War, he was drafted into the Army. He was presented the Medal of Freedom by then President Obama. And of course, his exploits on the baseball diamond. I remember as a kid, my dad, and I didn't even know who Willie Mays was at the time, tried to mimic the famous The Catch, the no-look over-the-shoulder World Series catch that he's been known so famously for. But he did a tremendous amount of work within the community as well that I don't believe gained enough attention as it possibly should have.
And we'll talk about what Barack Obama, former President Barack Obama, said as he shared his condolences, basically saying that Willie Mays was a wonderfully warm and generous person and an inspiration to an entire generation, and that Barack Obama said that he would never have had the chance to be president if it hadn't been for someone like Willie Mays. How many more people do you think are in that same position, that Willie Mays just opened up the doors for so many more people to be in a position to influence the nation?
Well, on many levels, all of us can say that, not just those who held the highest office in the land. There's levels to it. Willie Mays, who was the 10th Major League Baseball player, black baseball player, as the Negro League started to transition over into Major League Baseball, coming from the deep, deep South. Many of the barriers that were broken by Willie Mays at a time when baseball was truly America's pastime and it captivated America's consciousness. Willie Mays showed a very racist and divided America during that time who black people were, and almost equally as important, who we were not, based upon some of the tropes and the stigmas that surrounded the black community and who we were and how we were viewed. He broke down many of those barriers on the biggest and brightest of stages alongside the Mickey Mantles of the world. It were those two who were some of the most popular figures in this country during that time, and a black man no less. So while it may not be at the level of the chief officer of this country, Willie Mays and others, they paved the way for even people like myself to move forward in this country.
So I didn't know this until today. Last night, really, of how he got the nickname, the Say Hey Kid. It was courtesy of a sports writer who noticed that Willie at first didn't know everyone's name and he would just say hey. And I just thought that that really spoke to when he was, living in Harlem and he would just play stickball in the streets with the kids, how much he just was like, also just a regular guy.
Absolutely. He brought, and I wish that it was mentioned a bit more, because he faced quite a bit of criticism for not being quite there on the front lines of the civil rights movement as many others, like the obviously Jackie Robinson and Wilt Chamberlain and Jim Brown and some of the others who came after him. But he quietly did a lot of work outside the Polo Grounds when the Giants were still in New York. And then when he helped usher in the westward expansion of Major League Baseball alongside the Dodgers when they came out west, he continued that work out in Bayview, Hunters Point, with the community center and the work that he did in the inner city areas that are almost exclusively black communities. He did a lot of those things under the cover of secrecy, without purposely the view of many cameras. So he really put his imprint in many different ways that go largely unsung in terms of the work that he did. And he was a warm figure by many who are talking about his legacy today after as we mourn his loss. Many are talking about the man as warm as he was, and of course, the godfather of the great Barry Bonds as well.
Yeah, I loved learning that fact too about him. And I wish we could continue to talk about the life and legacy of Willie Mays, but we've run out of time. Sean Fletcher from San Jose State, appreciate your time.